Meanwhile, I'm sitting there and I'm looking around the room thinking, holy mackerel, I am in the Oval Office.
Professor David Demarest, thank you so much for being on 20-Minute Leaders.
Happy to be here.
Such an honor to have you here. You were one of my favorite professors of my 1 year at Stanford, and I'm sure looking back at the 4 years, that you're still going to be one of my favorite professors because the amount of inspiration that you gave me and I think 19 others in the class is just unparalleled to what we could have hoped for. Professor Demarest, you were one of the head of communications for the George Bush Sr. administration in the White House, Bank of America, Visa with branding and communications, and an expert on strategy. I just want to hear stories over these 20 minutes and hear, some of the incredible lessons that you taught us. Professor, can you tell me a little bit about where you came from and how you even got to be in communications for George Bush Sr.?
Well, I had been active in politics generally for a number of years, helping to rebuild what was then a struggling political party, meaning the Republican Party in the late 70s, and had some success doing that. Reagan was elected in 1980, and my boss, who was the chairman of the Republican Party, became the U.S. Trade Representative. And he asked me to come run public affairs for that cabinet agency. And that started a career in government that went on for about 12 years. But there was one break, and that was when I had the opportunity to be communications director for the first President Bush's presidential campaign in '88. And it was an absolute honor to work for him, but also to play on a national stage. I had been Assistant Secretary of Labor. I had a long career in politics and government, as I mentioned, but having the opportunity to work at that level nationally was really very exciting.
I'm sure, yeah.
And then, he won, and I went into the White House as the White House communications director. It was a wild ride. And I think one of the things that I took from that was to always maintain your perspective, that this was not a permanent job. The White House careers rise and fall overnight. You have to be able to accept that. The demands on your time and your energy are extraordinary. You have to be able to accept that. But throughout it all, I think one of the things that served me very well was that I never sort of took that job as an entitlement, that it was a job that I was privileged to have. I was privileged to serve, President Bush, but I knew that it was going to end at some point, whether it was going to be 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 8 years, whatever it was going to be, it was going to be over. And I couldn't let myself think that that was my, kind of my life. And right. I think keeping things in perspective like that helped me when, he did not win his reelection. Right. I was out of work for 8 months, and it never really caused me, significant distress. And I think about what's happening today right. with all the dislocation that people are undergoing. It's heartbreaking in many cases. People are losing their businesses or their livelihoods. But this too shall pass. And if you look at the positives that have come from this, people that I have talked with, and I acknowledge that I am privileged and have some resources. But the time I've been able to spend with my family has been extraordinary. The time that I've had to think about the next phase of my teaching has been a godsend. Just the ability to kind of reflect and sit back and take it all in and think about next steps. Looking at all of this not as a threat, but an opportunity, I think is incredibly important.
So, Professor, what I of course forgot to mention, which I tried to imply, was that you're a distinguished professor of the Stanford Business School. I got to take a class with you as an undergraduate because you so kindly agreed to teach an undergraduate class on strategy. And really, you could replace the name strategy with the name context, if between us, correct? But I think it's an incredible take on what's happening today. But I have to know. You're in the White House. How often do you go into the Oval Office? How often do you interact with President Bush? And what does that sense of responsibility feel like when you know that you're in a position that perhaps most Americans can't even imagine to be sitting where you're sitting?
Well, it's an incredible honor. I probably went into the Oval Office to meet with the president every other day.
Wow.
And now, having said that, the first time I went into the Oval Office, when he called me in to work on a speech, he didn't like the speech that had been delivered to him, and he was uncomfortable with it.
Yeah.
And I got this call saying, the president wants to see you in the Oval Office. Well, of course, my heart started thumping. And I walk in and I sit down, and he starts saying, I'm not sure this speech hits all the right notes. I know a lot of these people. A lot of them are friends of mine. These were CEOs that he was going to be talking to at a luncheon. And he says, they probably are doing a lot of the community activities already. I don't want to talk down to them. Meanwhile, I'm sitting there and I'm looking around the room thinking, holy mackerel, I am in the Oval Office. He then says, okay. And I realize the meeting's over. I haven't heard a thing he said. And I couldn't very well say to him, I really wasn't paying much attention because I was so overwhelmed by looking at the grandfather clock and the two seats where the heads of state sit and, the oval rug with the presidential seal on it and all that. And so I got up and I walked out and I thought to myself, I am screwed. I have no idea how to make this speech right. And it's a longer story than that, but I've taken major celebrities into the Oval Office to meet with the president, and they too are awed. I took Michael Jackson into the Oval Office, the gloved one, right?
You walked next to Michael Jackson and ushered him into the Oval Office. I
did. And it was a very bizarre meeting, and it was surreal is what it was. But
how does that even work? So somebody says, somebody who's well known and has a lot of impact can just say, hey, I want to meet with the president, get me an hour in the Oval Office?
No, it doesn't quite work that way. One of my staff had heard from Michael Jackson's people that he wanted to see the Lincoln bedroom. Okay. He wanted to visit the White House and see the Lincoln bedroom. And we then said, let's up this and have him do a photo with the president in the Oval Office. Well, little did I know that he was going to bring a big entourage with him. And so I had to cleave the entourage from him, and I made him come up and meet with me in my office first. That was sort of a bizarre meeting. And then I didn't ever let him link back up with his entourage and just took him and his manager into the Oval Office.
This is just
incredible. He didn't
incredible.
exactly connect with the president, but he did connect with Mrs. Bush, and it was a very interesting interaction.
Wow.
Now, what I didn't know, and this was the mischievous part of President Bush, as he's in the Oval Office, he says, now, Michael, we're going to go out and do what we call a photo opportunity, like Michael did. And we're going to go out into the Rose Garden, and I'm going to have a few remarks about Mr. Gorbachev. And the press secretary and myself are thinking, what? He's going to walk out into the Rose Garden where there's like this enormous gaggle of reporters with Michael Jackson, and he's going to talk about Gorbachev? He walks out into the Rose Garden, and he announces the first summit meeting with the Soviet Union, standing with Michael Jackson. It was a surreal moment beyond surreal moments. And all we could think of, and Marlon Fitzwater, the press secretary, got into a kind of a giggle about it, was that we imagined the KGB watching this and trying to figure out, why is he announcing this with Michael Jackson? What is the significance of this? And we got quite a kick out of it.
That's just
and
incredible.
Then it was just pure George Bush.
Of course. Okay, Professor Demarest, moving on, you're you're director of communications and branding at two of the most incredible corporations that really have both critical infrastructure in our daily lives, but have really changed the way we interact with our financial institutions, and with responsibilities greater than just financial institutions. Some of the case studies that we've studied in our class from your positions there just showed us how these corporations, their impact goes far beyond just the exchange of money and storing our money. That's Bank of America and Visa, of course. What did you learn running communications and branding for these incredible companies?
Well, I think the biggest learning that I had from that experience was to understand that brand is much more than just a logo. Brand is much more than presentation. Brand is really about a promise, and it's a promise to customers. Could be a promise to the community. It could be a promise about social responsibility. All large, impactful organizations make promises to a wide range of constituencies.
Right.
And their reputation is dependent upon whether those constituencies to whom the promise is made believe that it has been a promise kept. And so it's changed my thinking about how to understand reputation, how to understand brand, and in a much, the lens that I look at brand is a much wider lens than it was previously.
Right.
The other thing I think I learned primarily at the latter stage of my corporate career was how important strategic thinking is.
Yes.
And the ability to think strategically. And what are the ingredients for strategic thinking? And you mentioned context. That is a key ingredient, a rigorous understanding of context. And then understanding how one action creates another action.
Talk to me a little bit about this. Talk to me about this chess game of understanding, because throughout the course, almost at every case study, we understood in hindsight that if we could just think a little bit further ahead and play this chess game internally and realize, there were some instances where we were amazed by how you realized back then, in 1970, that one action is going to lead to another, and you were able to save 6 months of hardships and millions and hundreds of millions of dollars. How can we possibly do that? Sit down and try to imagine what the possible scenarios are so that we can, avoid the hardships already.
Yeah, I think one of the words you just used is critical. Imagine. You have to have a flourishing and thriving imagination capability.
Right.
And that comes with test driving ideas. It comes with not letting the emperor walk around with no clothes.
Right.
It comes with defining reality, looking at things with a critical eye. If you look at what's happened today with this whole pandemic, there was a distinct lack of thinking ahead and thinking about consequence, and the absence of defining what was reality. All these mixed messages that have come out for the last 6 months have been incredibly destructive to having a coherent strategy. And so I think that the idea of really getting ingrained in your head that everything you do is going to have a consequence, and that consequence is going to have a consequence, and so forth and so forth and so forth. And the more you're able to take those steps, the further you take those steps, the more you're going to land on the right landing zone that is going to be the most positive.
Sure. And all of these are leadership positions that you have quite a few people under you, and a lot of these times it sounds like they're more crisis management than they are just thinking strategically, right? Because you're every time you're confronted with a communications crisis or a branding crisis, you're the go-to guy and says, David, please help us solve this. This is your time to shine. How do you go about doing that? I mean, how is leading in a crisis different than leading when times are good and you're just thinking about the next nice project to do?
Well, as you heard me say in class, the best crisis management is to avert the crisis in the first place.
Yeah.
And so that means a lot of thinking about where are the potential crises.
Right.
They're all out there. There are all these landmines out there. And if you're able to identify them early, you can navigate them with more skill. However, that doesn't mean to say that you can avoid every crisis.
Right.
And I think the important thing in crisis management, well, there's several things. One is something called deliberate calmness. You have to create an environment for yourself that is deliberately calm so that you can ask the right questions.
Right.
And a lot of times in a crisis, you'll watch people run around thinking that, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? What are we going to do? And they haven't asked the most important question, which we said a lot in class, which is, okay, what do we know? What do we know about this circumstance?
And what do we need to know?
Exactly. And so if we ask the right questions and we do so in a thoughtful, calm, organized way, you'll not only be able to navigate through the moment, but you'll also be able to understand what the ramifications are longer term. McKinsey calls that integrative thinking, the kind of thinking that you can simultaneously think about what you have to do in the moment. At the same time, you're thinking about the implications for the future. And that's what we really needed in this current environment, were people that could do that.
I think it's incredible. I mean, every time we walked into class and we received the case study ahead of time, and we were so pumped, we would discuss it for hours, my good friend Santiago and I, before coming to class, and we come in and all of a sudden you say, okay, wait, stop. What do you know? What do you need to know? And then the second half was only, okay, how can we now use this information to process through this? But it's not just jumping in and with the first instinct just acting. Professor, you're looking at now, this global pandemic, it was, at least to me, very apparent in the tech community that almost every company and every institution decided to deal with things differently. Also in terms of universities. You have universities that until today have not decided on what's happening next year. You have universities that have already decided that they're closed next year for physical studies, and you have universities that have already said they're open. So it sounds like globally there's not really strategic strategy for communicating with the public. Of course, looking at governments, it's very similar. What's your take on this? Well, what does it take from a government or an institution to power through a crisis that we just don't know what it is? We just don't know what the ending is.
Well, first of all, you have to communicate coherently and consistently. Mm-hmm. And that includes communicating what you don't know.
Okay.
And I think that early on, there were a lot of leaders, I won't get into too many specifics, but there were a lot of leaders who communicated about things they knew nothing about. Right. And made assertions and comments that were confusing to the public. You had some leaders, and I would say some of the governors, I think, showed incredible forthrightness and calm. And I think of somebody like Governor Cuomo in New York. Every day,
very impressive. Yes,
briefing and saying what they know, what they don't know, what are the practical steps, what are the responsible steps. He also was a moral leader about what were people's responsibilities.
Yes,
and he practiced what he preached. All of those things go into having an ability to mobilize not just public opinion, but public action. And so that people weren't demonstrating in the streets. They weren't, resisting what was calm and deliberative leadership.
Definitely, and I mean, you look at New Zealand just as another case study, and you see
exactly.
the Prime Minister standing every day, and I watched quite a few of those because I was just inspired every time she had a question, and then she looked to the doctor on her right and said, I don't know this, do you know this? Let's write it down, let's check on this, and we'll come back to you tomorrow. And the next day she would come back to it. That's leadership to me. The leadership taking ownership of what you know, what you don't know, and over-communicating, not under-communicating. I talked to quite a few, through this show, I talked to quite a few CEOs of companies, both large and small, and one thing that constantly came up is this idea of always over communicate, never under communicate, especially in a time of crisis. That trust that you're building, and I think we talked about this quite a bit about in the context of branding. It's you gain the trust along the way with the actions you do. It's very easy to break the trust, to do a single, right?
Yeah, well, and the other thing is that now more than ever, given that communications don't take place in a vacuum, there is this communications environment that we live in today, of social media and highly partisan media that is out there fomenting misinformation, disinformation. Some of it's accurate information, but how do you tell the difference? Well, that's where you need government leaders, corporate leaders to be more thoughtful so that they can command the public's attention. When they're sending mixed messages, who does the public turn to for an authoritative source? There is no one.
Right. Definitely. No, it's incredible. Professor, right before we leave, I want to get, your overall insight. I'm looking at myself as a young entrepreneur. I am very excited to one day start my company, hopefully sooner rather than later. I'm even more excited to be in one of your classes, hopefully as a GSB student myself one day. But if you could give me, one or two key pieces of advice looking forward from your, enormous career, both in corporate and the public service, but also at Stanford, which you ran communications, which I didn't even mention. What should I take with me over my next few decades as I aim to be a leader myself?
I think about three things, and I think best in threes.
Yes.
One is always find your colleagues, people that you're working with, that are worthy of respect. You want to work with people that you respect.
Right.
Second, always find something that allows you to grow. Intellectually, perhaps financially, but most importantly, that is going to drive your intellectual curiosity and keep it vibrant and thriving. And finally, knowing you as I do, I think I would say always make sure you're involved in something beyond yourself so that it's bigger than you. And that will, I think, give your life and your career that much more purpose.
I love it, and definitely I think having this one-on-one here and everything that I've learned from you, and I want to thank you again for the incredible course that you taught us and for all the inspiration. I think that it's one thing as a class to come in and show you that we're learning and that we're progressing and we are enjoying it, but I have to tell you that outside of the classroom, the number of meaningful discussions we've had and the thoughts we shared on how inspiring this was, it really, I think, changed a lot of our thinking in the context of what it means to be a person who thinks strategically, a person who looks at a problem and understands that it's bigger than just the 100 words written on the page. Context is everything. It's all about what we don't know as much as what we know and what we need to know in order to feel comfortable solving the puzzle. So thank you very much. Right before we leave, 3 words that best describe you.
Optimistic, principled,
yeah,
and determined.
I love it. Professor Demarest, thank you very, very much. Enjoy your time in Florida. Enjoy your time with your family. And I look forward to seeing you on campus one day in person.
Okay, you take care, Michael.
Take care. Thank you for the time.